All right, welcome back to ABA exam review and the continuation of our BCBA task list series with G4 stimulus and response prompts and fading. This is less about the idea of prompts and more about the idea of fading out the prompts in order to transfer stimulus control. Because with prompts, you always want to make sure there's a fading plan in place. Because remember, those prompts are nothing more than temporary SDs that we need to get rid of so that the natural SD will take control. As always, check out behavioranalyststudy.com for all of our study materials, including our combo pack. When you pass your exam, let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. Work hard, study hard. Let's get going. So, G4 prompts. Antecedent stimuli used to evoke a correct response in the presence of the correct SD. Probably something or nothing you don't know, right? I think everyone's pretty familiar with our prompts. We have our SD, we have our prompt, we have our response, and then our consequence. As always, the prompt goes in between the SD and the response, and this becomes the temporary SD, which is why we have to fade it out eventually. That's the entire idea, because you want the correct SD or the natural SD to control that response. You don't want the prompt always controlling the response, but we use prompts in order to get to that point. Response prompts directly act on the response, while stimulus prompts directly act on the antecedent target stimuli. Very easy to remember. Are your prompts focused on the stimuli, or are your prompts focused on the response? For example, with the response prompts, a verbal prompt, you're going to occur often throughout teaching and training. So if I say point to yellow, and then I say, where is yellow? Where is yellow is my prompt. Maybe not the best example. If I point to a picture of a dog and say, what is this? And then I say dog, that's a verbal prompt. Those verbal prompts can be spoken, written, they can be pictures, think, verbal behavior. You're going to be verbally prompting a lot. That verbal prompt is acting directly on the response you want to see. Modeling. Modeling is a demonstration of the desired behavior. In order to use modeling, the learner has to have pre-attention skills and these pre-academic skills where they can sit and watch a model and then imitate. If they can't attend to a model and they can't imitate, well, then modeling is not going to be very effective. But with modeling, you're going to demonstrate the response you want to see. Again, acting directly on the response. And then, of course, physical guidance is the most intrusive response prompt we have, right? We have partial physical, full physical, and graduated guidance, where we are physically guiding either fully or partially the learner's movements. So again, acting directly on the response. With stimulus prompts, these are sometimes a little more confusing. Just always think, am I focused on the response or the stimulus? Because of the stimulus prompt, we're acting directly on the antecedent target stimuli to cue that response. So a movement prompt, sometimes maybe referred to as a gestural prompt, where you're pointing to, you're tapping, you're touching, or looking at the correct stimulus. If I have 1, 2, 3, and I say point to 2, and then I start tapping 2, that's a movement prompt. I am acting on the stimulus. That's where it can get a little tricky. We're acting directly on the stimulus. Positional, you're going to move the target stimulus. So if I have this field of 3, 1, 2, and 3, and then I move 2 closer, that's a positional prompt. I'm moving the target stimulus, and we are acting again directly on the stimulus. And then a redundancy prompt, where we're making a dimension of the stimulus of the response associated with the correct response. So if I made sure that when I said point to 3 and I had these little dots and we're focused on the 3 edges of this 3, that might be a redundancy prompt. Again, we're acting directly on the stimuli. That's the difference between a response prompt and a stimulus prompt. As an RBT, if you worked it as an RBT, this wasn't as important. As a BCBA, you've got to know the difference. Am I acting on the response or the stimulus? Because there's going to be given times where it's going to be better to act on the response or the stimuli, depending on your client. If you have fields, fields of 3, and it's very easy to manipulate stimuli, stimuli prompts might be a lot easier to execute than a response prompt. For example, what if your client doesn't want to be physically prompted? You've got to figure out, you have your response. When you're prompting, the prompt is evoking the response. We don't want that. We need to fade this out so it's no longer there. We want the SD to evoke the response. That's the entire idea. And so when you're transferring stimulus control, you're essentially transferring control from the prompt to the SD. Now, there's other ways to transfer stimulus control, but in the context of prompting, that's what we're doing. So think about our strategies we use to prompt. They all promote stimulus control and transferring stimulus control. With errorless learning, we're not even going to allow incorrect responses. A lot of times that means physical prompting. You don't allow incorrect responses to happen. One way of errorless learning is time delay, where you present a target stimulus and a prompt together. So let's say square and touch. So we're going to present those together. As the learner gets better, you're going to increase the time. Where you have square, 1, 2, 3, and then touch. You've increased the time in between the presentation of the stimulus and the prompt. You can see, right, how that time delay is going to build up, hopefully, the strength of the skill. Now, at most to least, you're typically going to start with your physical guidance, your most intrusive prompt first, and then fade it out. Notice the word typically, right? Because everything's individualized, but pretty much the physical prompt is the most intrusive prompt you're going to find. So if you're going to start most to least with the most intrusive prompt, it's likely going to be physical. Now, how you fade it afterwards might be dependent on your client. And then least to most, where you allow the participant to engage in the response with little assistance and then gradually increase insistence. So it's the opposite, right? You might, on the first try, not prompt at all. Then maybe you introduce a verbal prompt and then a visual prompt, so on and so forth. With the least to most, it's the advantage of you're only giving as much prompting as necessary. A most to least, you're typically going to start with a very intrusive prompt. So it just depends on your learner. Are they prompt dependent? Is it hard to fade prompts? You've got to take these things into consideration when choosing what type of stimulus or when choosing what type of strategy to use when thinking about transferring stimulus control. Remember, we plan ahead, right? So when you're planning, you've got to be thinking down the lines of how am I going to transfer? How am I going to fade? Two final things, stimulus fading and shape transformation. These are straight from Cooper because I think these examples really illustrate what we're talking about. With stimulus fading, you can see, right, we have this very bold A, and then gradually it's gone. We have this very bold 9, gradually it's gone. Eventually it's just going to be 4 plus 5 equals, and they've got to answer it themselves. And then stimulus shape transformation, which is not often talked about or used, but this is the idea, right? It's a empirical strategy, so it's good to know. Or you start with a picture of a car and then you fade it into the actual SD, or I should say stimulus that you want. That stimulus shape transformation.